came to Houston Audubon in 1994, I believe. Started as a new birder. Oh, had to be 92. 92, 93, became a birder and volunteer after that at High Island. And then in the late 90s, came on the board and was the president from 2001 to 2003 after Dwight Peak. I've lived in Texas my whole life, and our family had a place in Rockport and would go there every weekend. And when I say every weekend, I mean Friday, school's out, pick us up from school, take us to Rockport. And I grew up there hunting, fishing, skiing, and was outdoors all the time since I was a little bitty boy, could walk, and grew up, in that hunting and fishing community and just enjoying the outdoors. And 1992, my stepmother gave me a book about Connie Hagar. And Connie Hagar was a famous amateur ornithologist. To call her a birder is an injustice. She was a serious amateur ornithologist back in the pre-World War II and post-World War II period. And she lived in Rockport and had moved down there World War II era because they'd visited and just by happenstance saw lots of birds, and she was big into birding, so she somehow coaxed her husband into buying a motel there, and that became their business. And she would take the hotel guest out birding with her, and word kind of spread. And she starts, back then there was no internet, there were no computers, no nothing. She would write notes to a publication put out back then called, where they would say, here's unusual bird sightings around the U.S., and people would read that, and ornithologists would read it. And she was writing up all these reports of just massive numbers of birds and unusual birds occurring around the Rockport area. And so it really, was sticking out like a glowing red light about Rockport and that little central coastal area. And some of the big name ornithologists from the Northeast were reading this going, man, we're going to go down there and straighten this lady out, get her head on straight, put an end to all this nonsense she mails us every month. And sure enough, one of them went down there and it's like, he said, okay, I want you to take me out. And I think it was mountain plover or something. Show me some of these, or buff-bellied sandpiper. He said, okay, let's do it. Drove straight out there, showed him. He's like, wow, well, how about this thing, you wrote in? She went, showed him that. And he's like, so he ended up going birding with her for about 4 or 5 days and made a convert out. He's like, you know what? She's right. She's absolutely right. It's a magic place. So it kind of made Rockport a hot spot on the national level back in the days before birding was a thing. But anyway, so stepmom knew of my interest in Rockport, and even as an adult, would continue to go there. And so she thought, okay, here's an interesting Christmas present, and gave it to me. And I was reading it, just first looking at it towards the history of Rockport. But it's mentioning all these birds. I'm thinking, man, I duck hunt out here all the time. Fish, what are these things? Great egret. What the heck's a great egret? Or roseate spoonbill. What the heck is that? So I found a bird book somewhere. Turned out it was Peterson's Birds of Texas. So I start looking up, like, well, there is no way a thing like that lives in Texas. I just don't believe it. Next weekend, go down there, it's like, wow. It's just like somebody flipped a switch in my mind. Man, there's a great egret. There's a snowy egret. There's a roseate spoonbill. Of course, I'm seeing the big birds starting off. And I mean, that was just the magic at that moment. And it literally is like somebody just flipped a switch. So really, it's due to Connie Hagar's biography. This is back in the early 90s, and birding, was kind of starting to get in the newspaper, and I can't remember if we saw it in the Houston newspaper or something, but somehow read about, this is literally like weeks after I'd read this book, so I guess Christmas, read the book, and then January, something in the newspapers talking about High Island, and I had binoculars from doing outdoor stuff. So all right, let's go. So we had that Peterson Birds of Texas, and we started driving to High Island. Well, first thing we know, we come over to the big bridge over the Trinity River, and you look over on the south side of the road, and there's a big rookery there, all the egrets and spoonbills. We're like, ooh, that looks like a good place. Let's stop and look at birds. And we get out and we see some of those and pull a little farther down the road towards the river, and it's kind of flooded timber area. And I can't remember which bird we saw first, but I remember vividly the two first ones we saw were a Carolina wren and a Wilson's warbler. We saw that little Carolina wren just looking through binoculars and he's singing. And it's just like, wow, that little bird, just look at that. I mean, we were both wowed by it. I mean, we just thought this was amazing to watch this little teeny tiny bird just sing and sing and going crazy. And then we saw the Wilson's warbler, this bright yellow bird, like, wow, look at this. This is amazing. This lives in Texas. What? How can this be? And I mean, you talk about the hook being set. So we're like, oh, birding is great. This is awesome. Let's do it. It's like, oh, we got to go to High Island. I read in this book, this is the thing. High Island, birds everywhere. And we get over there. And back then, Houston Audubon didn't own Smith Oaks. And there's a place called Birders Haven. And it was a little bed and breakfast. And so we parked at Birders Haven thinking, man, that's got to be the place. Birders Haven, we're going there. We park, and we're walking around. It's like, we're not seeing anything. What's wrong? The book says they're all over the place. I see nothing. Maybe a cardinal. It's like, well. So we start roaming through what now is the parking area of Smith Oaks. And back then it was, had some oil tanks and cattle and cow patties. And we're walking around stepping in cow patties. Like, man, what's this all about? This isn't exactly what we were thinking. And Winnie Burkett happened to be there that day. And she walked up, it's like, hey, what's going on? I said, well, we're looking for all the birds in the High Island. We read about in this book, and where are they? She said, okay, let me explain how this works. And she's trying to explain migration to us, like, oh, okay, well, that makes some sense. She's like, come back in April, and we'll show you around. And so really, Winnie's graciousness, spending 10 minutes with us that cold, muddy day, stepping in cow patties, really, kind of got us on the hook. And she said, come back here and I'll show y'all where to go. And she showed us where the Boy Scout Woods was and says, you come back here in April in this gate and there'll be people all over here. You check in with us and we'll get somebody to help show you around and help you out. And sure enough, we came back in April and it was just fantastic day, just wonderful, delightful day. And so that's how I got tied in with Houston Audubon. And so we kept going to visit. And finally I was like, well, let's come volunteer and help. And they were always looking. Back then, Houston Audubon really was purely a volunteer group. Had a couple of part-time staff, but it really was a volunteer-run group. And so they grab everybody they can get to be a volunteer. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. And so we started volunteering. That's how we got involved. If you worked for Winnie back then as a volunteer at High Island, job one, day one, pulling tallow trees. And we're out there pulling these little bitty tallow trees, like pulling weeds out of a garden. And I'm telling you, if I pulled one, I pulled 1,000 that day. I was like, man, to this day, tallow's my bitter enemy. I just hate it. And after doing that for 2 or 3 times, I'm like, there's got to be a better way to deal with this than sitting out here pulling weeds, these little things. And they were everywhere back then. And so I'm thinking, okay, I want to get some professional advice. And I don't know who I talked to, but somewhere found a professional arborist or tree person. Might have been just somebody on the street. I can't remember, but I saw a professional tree person say, hey, here's the problem. We're volunteering at this thing over in High Island. They have these tallow trees, and they have them everywhere. And told him what we were doing. He said, okay, you're doing it backwards. The way you got to tackle this, find the biggest ones. You kill the biggest ones first, and you work from biggest to the smallest. You keep killing the big ones off, and you'll make some headway after a while. I said, okay, I'm going to do it. And went out and I bought a professional logging chainsaw. I mean, it's got a bar this big, turns 12,000 RPMs, like what you see on TV, and got Kevlar and hard hat. I mean, I showed up the next volunteer day, and I had my logging chainsaw in my outfit. Winnie's eyes are like, what the heck? I mean, I'm trying to be polite here, but very excited. So what are you up to? I said, I talked to somebody and I got the way to deal with tallow trees. We're going to cut down the biggest ones right now. She's like, what? We had little words and we kind of got it. She's like, well, you go over in that far corner over there and, you're killing tallow trees, so I'm okay with it. As long as you kill tallows and nothing else. And I'm telling you, they were predominant plant, tree, whatever. I mean, they outnumbered everything else by 50%. So we went out and found the biggest tallows we could find away from the buildings and got after them with our chainsaw. I mean, my poor wife, God bless her soul, she was out there helping machete clear them work areas. But we were cutting tallow trees, no exaggeration, very literally 3 and 4 feet in diameter. It looked like a TV logging show. And people were starting to get upset. Hey, you're cutting down some huge, giant trees. You're killing where all the birds come. It's like, no, we're making way for the trees the birds need. They don't use the tallow trees. The tallow trees in a milkweed family gives a little sap. It actually kills and suppresses all the plants around it. And that's what I learned from the tree professional. He's like, if you kill this stuff out, it'll go away and you'll get regrowth in behind it. So, people that first year or two when we were getting after it were getting upset about knocking down these really big trees. And what we found, High Island gets a huge amount of rain, but we would cut them and check the growth rings. We found the trees were growing 1 inch in girth per year. So you'd get a tree this big around, it's only a 20-year-old tree, but it's crowding out the ability of oaks and hackberries and other desirable trees to come in. And so, once Winnie kind of got on board with like, okay, you got a game plan, I'll stay out of the way and y'all do your thing. And don't get any of my other volunteers on your work crew chainsaw and I'll stay out of your way. And so we did, and we did that for several years, just hammering and hammering. And I was living in Houston at the time, and I mean, we had a weekend, we'd go over there and just chainsaw and chainsaw and chainsaw and got after it. So that's really, my first volunteering effort was on that front. And after a while, I saw Winnie one day, and I said, Winnie, I'd like to kind of do something else besides tallow trees. Is there something else I could get involved in? She said, I bet we can find some other things for you. And I didn't hear anything. And it's kind of probably going ahead of the story, but a little while later, got a call from, I was out doing the Great Texas Birding Classic week-long competition, and this is in the late 90s. Cell phones, people watching this today will never believe this. Cell phones weren't invented back then, but I was managing litigation for a large corporation, managing all their litigation in 8 states, and had about 100 outside lawyers that I was managing and 80,000 cases at the time. So I had a car phone. The company put a car phone, which sounds neat at the time. It's like, ooh, you got a car phone. It's like, yeah, well, that way they got a leash on me and I can't ever get away from them. But we were out doing the Great Texas Birding Classic, phone rings. It's like, hey, what's up? I'm thinking it's the client calling. It's like, hey, this is Dwight Peak, and I'd known Dwight from birding trips, especially doing offshore pelagic trips. He's like, hey, Jeff, president at that point was P.D. Hull. So it's like, PD's, got some stuff going on. So, I'm kind of having to take over, be president. So I need some backup. Would you mind helping? I'm like, no, sure, I'll be happy to help. And so we kind of had a ahead of schedule transition. So I came in, started helping Dwight, and there's a lot more story behind that. But that's kind of the transition of how I went from birding in the cow patties to 5 years later, all of a sudden, on the path to being the president. It was a small but mighty force, is the best way I would describe it. The group at that point was only 25 years old, but it was a very small group of very committed, very active, very passionate people that hardcore birding community, and I mean the hardest of the hardcore of the U.S. this is ground zero for it. I mean, there are very few places anywhere in the U.S. that had such a group of really hardcore, serious birders. And with that, they were committed to trying to protect their birding places where they were seeing birds. And I'm sure you've talked to and heard a lot of the names already, but, those people that are names on sanctuaries and plaques, I mean, they're real people, and they're just ordinary working people, and they were birders, and they're just like, you know what? I'm not going to sit here and watch this stuff just vanish in front of my eyes. I'm going to do something, and they did it. And it's, I've always thought one of the great strengths of Houston Audubon, its great strength, not one of them, but the great strength of Houston Audubon and Houston is the people and their attitude. It's always been can do, let's make something happen. Don't sit there and just complain. It's make it happen. If you see something needs doing, let's figure out a way to do it. And it had, I would say, a few hundred people that were really passionate, actively involved in this network of like minded people. It was a volunteer group at that point. There were part time staff, one helping with some fundraising periodically, and the one that was half volunteer, birder, and half kind of run the administrative end of things. But it was largely a purely volunteer group, and it was very effective at tackling the projects it put its mind on. It did advocacy, and a lot of things we see today that are preserved, like Charlotte, was about to vanish, and Houston Audubon stepped up to be one of the plaintiffs to fight that, and Jim Blackburn led that fight, and that would have been underwater and been a water reservoir for Houston. Wouldn't have been much of a water reservoir. It's only going to be 5 or 6 feet deep, I think was the plan, but it was going to wipe out the only nest of bald eagles in the area. Back then, bald eagles were incredibly rare, wildly rare. But there were some at Lake Charlotte, and so they fought to protect that. That's just one example, or High Island, or Bolivar. And these people were passionate about saving that, and then the prairies. There are a handful of people that were absolutely critical and pivotal in the, not of this organization, its survival, what it became, the fact that it's even still here today. Not only it's just survived, but thrived. And I always hesitate to mention people by name or a short list for fear of lessening the importance of so many people. And I mean, there are a ton of people that were hugely important, again, as a volunteer group. But there's a couple that are just, it would be, if we're trying to capture history of the group, the time I was active, they were absolutely critical key players and allies in helping achieve what we were trying to do. And again, in no particular order. So, and if somebody's name isn't on here, it makes me cringe to not name everybody. I could go on for 2 hours, but Winnie Burkett was critical, the time I was around, because she was the nexus into a lot of contacts with a lot of volunteers. That's how I came to be involved in Houston Audubon. Her, Bolivar and High Island were kind of her areas, and she brought so many people into the group through her contact with volunteers. So, her, Dwight Peak, got some of the history earlier, but Dwight brought me into the more formal board level, and the two of us really could not have done what either one of us did without the other one. So I mean, really view him as a key partner. He had young children at the time and really saw the vision of what the education program is now. And he found Marianne Weber, which has just been a godsend. Just can't emphasize the importance of that. It's not luck. He did something. And Marianne's another person, just right person, right time, right place to help put stabilization, professional training, the birds, and make that thing just catch and go at the right time. A key part of that, 3 prongs of the education. So, Dwight, Marianne, really give them credit for that education nexus. Joy Hester, interesting, she's worn so many hats for this group. Key volunteer, another one of my lawyers friends and colleagues. She came from working for an oil company, I think it was Baker Hughes, if I remember right, doing real estate. She stepped up and volunteered and kind of got sucked into the Houston Audubon vortex when we're doing all these land projects. First, helping as a lawyer, and then came on and went on to the board and was a just absolutely critical ally in some of these efforts that we had. And then when we were having a lot of trouble finding the right person to be executive director, and we went through a handful in pretty quick succession, Joy finally said, I'll step off the board and I'll do it for a little while, just kind of, as a stopgap. And you know how that goes, oh, you're there, good, you're it. And I mean, she was the right magic, right person, right mindset, right skill set, right personality. And she stands out as absolutely pivotal in the transition from little bitty volunteer bird group into professional level staff and helped create that framework of hiring people, the right people at the right time, right place, to help it grow. And I mean, she went on to go on to the National Audubon Board and some other things, but she was critical to that transitional phase of little group to bigger formal group. And that, I just cannot overstate the importance of her in that role. Back when I came on, fundraising was pure volunteer driven, essentially. And a lot of people were important to it, but there really are a handful that were there every single day, treating it like a full-time job. And it is a hard job sometimes. We helped give them the message, which helped them do what they wanted to do, but they were there day in, day out, and it would be beyond a tragic omission if we didn't talk about them. But Caroline Callery, been there day in, day out, bringing people in, helping them get tied in. Sarah Betancourt's the other one, just a critical ally, and would help organize the galas, which were important for fundraising. They were important for community outreach and messaging. And she's been a constant force in a good, solid foundation, day in, day out, and later helped work with a professional development director that we brought in. But I just cannot emphasize that importance of that role that Sarah played. Nancy Powell Moore had a little birding group, and there's a story, and it's important, again, going back to the point of every contact we have with volunteers, you don't know how that's going to turn out into something you don't foresee. Nancy Powell Moore is another one of these women that had critical role in fundraising through personal efforts with a foundation, but more importantly through outreach and bringing people to it. And she had a deal with me. She said, I've got a little group of friends. I'd love for you to take us birding for a day. If you'll do it, I'll make a donation to Houston. I was like, man, I don't have to get paid to go birding. I'm always up for a good excuse to go birding. But yeah, let's do it. And she had a group of people. We did it every year. And her birding group, just going out and having fun, turned out to be pivotal supporters, again, of the group. Jim Wynn, so with Nancy Powell Moore to organize the field trips, she had the Wynns, Jim and Betsy Wynn. Jim, of course, went on to become president, got turned into a volunteer and dragged into it. And I mean, we could not be where we are right now without those kind of players. She also had Jean Graham. Jean Graham made she made the major initial gift of $500,000 that was a challenge grant that helped put the spark. And then Ann and Arthur Jones made another one just totally out of the blue, $250,000. There are people that had been on a bird trip, had little binoculars. And I remember Ann called me one day and said, hey, would you come over to my house? I need to talk to you about something. Oh, sure. What's up? Get over there. And she and her husband made a $250,000 gift. You just don't know where these things are going to come from. So, I want those people captured in the history of this group because they were individuals that took this group from little bitty bird club having bake sales, literally, in a once a year, every other 3 or 4 year gala, to put in a financial foundation under it to allow it to be what it is now. So I just wanted to make sure that they were captured in the history of this group. And there's so many more. Flo Hanna, God love her and God rest her soul. She was one of my birding buddies. Joy and Sarah Betancourt and Flo and I used to all do that water Christmas count. And, Joy was the director, and I wanted to do prairie stuff, and Flo was looking for a job. I started going birding with her when she was doing a graduate degree on Henslow Sparrow and chit-chatting with her. She's like, well, I've never actually seen one. I'm like, oh, come on. You're doing a degree and you don't even have seen one. Took her out and showed her Henslow Sparrows. And it's like, man, we need to figure out a way to get you in here and do something about prairies, because that's a big thing for me about coastal prairies, and the prairies in the Panhandle have been something tied to as a child. I was like, I want to get prairies on the agenda, and no one's doing anything really. She's like, okay. And so connected her with Joy. I was like, hey, let's go have lunch one day and let's talk to Joy, see if we can get you hired. And so one thing led to another, and she and Joy hit it off. And so that became she was professionally trained to help, do prairie conservation, and that sparked and grew into that. I'm sure people have told that history. So those are just some of the ones off the top of my head. And there's literally 1,000 more important, but it would be just a glaring omission not to capture the history of those people, make sure they're preserved. So that's it. It had, in the 90s, mid 90s, it had this passionate core group of people, and they were tackling certain little projects here and there and raising the money as needed. And High Island, the first purchases over there, they created the concept of bonds, and basically what it was people were on the board just said, yeah, I'll take on the debt personally to help buy this place that we all like to go birding. And so that's always been there. The scale of it, though, and really grew during the time Dwight was president, and I was working with Dwight, and I became president. And it was 50%, vision of where we wanted to go with things, and the other half was sheer survival due to external events. And so that period of the late 90s into the early 2000s was a critical period where it transitioned from pure volunteer, and then what I worked on and Dwight worked on was trying to put the framework in place to have a solid, sustainable framework of professional staff and infrastructure with volunteers supporting that. And the reason for that, there's many reasons, but Terry Hershey, when I first started really getting involved, just tremendous, wonderful human being. Named Hershey was as down-to-earth and good person as I've ever met, and I've met a bunch, and they're all damn good. But Terry said, when I first came on the board, she sat down with me one day and had a cup of coffee. He's like, look, here's the deal. An organization's life and its mission is good for about 3 cycles of a board. That's it. And so, Houston Audubon, it does good. And back, there were kind of, you go back, I think it was formed in 69. It'd be periods of where it's real active and doing stuff, and then periods where it's kind of hanging on by the fingernails. And because it's kind of ebbing and flowing as the volunteers would come and go. And she's just like, she knew what we were trying to do. And she's like, you got to figure out a way to make this thing self-sustaining. And we had external conflicts coming from funding. I went back through some of my newsletters, and there's a whole story, and you may want to set up a separate question for this. It's a long discussion, but back then, the primary funding for Houston Audubon was what was called due share from National Audubon. And I went back and checked the notes. National Audubon would pay Houston Audubon or any chapter $3 for each member. And so if you had 1,000 members on your newsletter list, they would mail you $3,000. And that check would come every month, and it'd ebb and flow. And they were always wanting you to do member drives to get people. But that was the primary, day in, day out budget of Houston Audubon, was that $3 a head of people on the newsletter list. And we were wanting to tackle projects and do education, do that. It's like, man, these things don't fit. And we're 1 or 2 cycles away of volunteers getting transferred job-wise, moving away. And so I'm like, okay, we got to figure out another way to get at this problem. And basically came up, like I said, I really credit Dwight, and 2 of us, really sat down and worked out a game plan. But 3 major prongs, which is advocacy, education, and land protection. Dwight had small children at the time. He was living in Galveston. He was a doctor in Galveston, had young children. He said, man, we got to have education as a key component of this. And how it fits with the other 2 is like, we can save this land, that land, whatever, but what we have to change is the mindset of the community. We can't be the first aid crew running in at the last second to save something. We got to change the values of the community. And that really, we got to deal with that when kids are children, get them to appreciate the outdoors. Like what I was saying, I grew up outside hunting and fishing, but get that connection. And back then, I remember we'd meet some young kids grown up in Houston. They'd never been outside the city limits, and they would be afraid to come in Edith L. Moore because they watch TV and see, lions and tigers, and they're afraid there's a lion or a tiger in the woods here at Edith L. Moore. It's like, no, that's not how it works. So Dwight took on responsibility for really making education a focal point at that time, and I don't know how he found her, but somehow he found Mary Ann Weber, and she was just the perfect person, perfect time. She had the birds. I was a lawyer, so advocacy was an easy fit for me to take on. And then the way we both looked at it and what we brought to the board was saying, look, here's where we want to go. Get the kids, the education programs, really scale it up. The Docent Guild was doing some things, and stuff what they were doing was good, but it wasn't conveying the real conservation ethic message that we wanted to drive home. And so it was like, we got to have something, we control the messaging, and it's all about conservation. And it's a subtle shift of birding as a gateway. It's a portal into the broader topic of conservation. And that's where, particularly I, coming from the hunting community, it's a major factor in the hunting ethos is conservation of the resource. And the birding groups, back then, it was about competitive birding and listing, and that's an important role to have that. But I was like, we got to repackage this and make the message about conservation. And we get people into conservation through birding. Birding itself is not the end game. It's the means to the conservation ethic. And then land acquisition was, okay, if everything else fails and this thing's about to go away and no one else is going to protect it, we'll step up and step in. And Houston back then was a big city for sure, no doubt about it. But, it was in the post-'70s, there was a big wave of growth in the Houston, Galveston area, and then it kind of quieted down. But by the 90s, it's starting to pick up again, and we could see things starting to vanish, and it's like, okay, what are we going to do? And I'd grown up, spent a lot of time in the Texas Panhandle with prairies. Well, coastal prairies were the most imperiled of all types of ecosystems. And it's like, we've got to make this a priority for conservation above wetlands, above forest. People see a forest cut down, they go, wow, they just cut down a forest. Well, you go out here and watch somebody plow up a native prairie. It's like, oh, they just plowed up a grass field, so what? But to save, if you want to save long-billed curlews or meadowlarks or Henslow sparrows, you have to save the grasslands. It's like, so instead of saying, I want to save Henslow sparrows, it's like, I've got to save what they need to survive and everything. That's why things that are dependent on that grassland community are the most imperiled all species, whether it's plants, flowers, birds, amphibians. So that was kind of my thing. I was like, prairies have got to be on the agenda. And then we're like, you know what? There's a side story about conflicts with National Audubon, but where is Houston Audubon's core strength? Where is its focal emotional energy? And now it was clearly centered around the Galveston to High Island nexus. And I'm like, okay, let's just make Bolivar our focal point for conservation. There's 1,000 fights we could pick anywhere, but it's like, let's put our energy and focus on that. People like it. We're connected to it. But there's a lot of stuff vanishing over there really fast, very fast. So, Dwight's like, yeah, I live in Galveston. Let's do this. And so we said, okay, I think it was 97, 98. Somebody have to fact check me on the precise dates. Let me take one step backwards. People go to Bolivar Flats today, think, wow, this must have been protected forever. When I started birding, it was not protected by any means. The only thing that was really, quote, protected was in the 80s. Houston Audubon had worked an agreement with the General Land Office, Texas General Land Office, to create the bollards, the big poles, to create a vehicle barrier to going into the most critical part where you have the mud flats. And that was it in the 80s and into the 90s. And then the first piece of land that Houston Audubon actually protected, I want to say, and again, somebody can check me on the dates, 97-ish, plus or minus a year either side of that, 97, 98. Like 150, 160 acres came up, and they said, okay, let's do this. It's like, okay, well, bam, there's more development going on around here. What are we going to do? And a tract came up, and it was in a bankruptcy proceeding. I believe Joy can check this, but it's became a 615-acre block west of Redalon Road, and around Redalon Road ran through it. And it's like, man, Dwight's like, we got to do this. Jeff, like, I totally agree. We got to do this. We had this little tiny group that's having bake sales to pay the electric bill at Edith Elmore, and that's not much of an exaggeration, literally. We'd have an annual gala, but I mean, budgets were itty bitty back then. Our whole annual budget was maybe $100,000 for stuff, and with 2 part-time staff and newsletters, and here we're going to go out and raise a couple $100,000, and it's like, Dwight and I are like, we just got to do this. I'm sorry. And so we both were on board. We come to the board meetings like, hey, here's what we're going to do. We got to do this. About half the board, we kind of prepped and got them ready, and they're like, yeah, we got to do this. The other half's like, are you crazy? You're nuts. This is so beyond it. And I'm not going to say it was a contentious meeting because there was not really conflict, but it was high energy of like, this is just like so wildly beyond anything we've ever done. Boy Scout Woods, when they bought that, was 7 or 8 acres, less than 10 acres. That was a big project. And we're talking about taking on 615 and all that goes with that, and maintenance. And, so there's a whole lot of people could come with a whole lot of reasons to say no. But, the board's kind of like, you're right. This whole message about conservation and protect the habitat. If we want to protect birds, we got to do that. And, but there were some people that were like, yeah, this is too much for us, too big a bite. Let's stick with doing our birding field trips. And it's like, no, it's us or it's nobody. If we don't do this, it will be a beach house development, and we're all going to go, oh, why didn't we say that? It's like, you know what? I'd rather try and fail than just fail by not trying. And there was a staff member who I'll leave unnamed for reasons to be obvious, but she stood up on literally, we're in this boardroom, she stood up on this chair, probably one just like this, stood up and started just shouting, you're going to be the death of this organization. Y'all are going to take us under with this crazy idea. What are you doing? The board is like, sit down, come on. And that led to, we had to revamp our staff after that. We had the 2 part-timers. The fellow doing the fundraising, he heard what we were up to, listening. He's like, I'm quitting right now. You don't even have to fire me. I quit. I'm out of here. And so board meeting later, we have our staff is wiped out, and now people are going, okay, what are you 2 clowns doing? You're really putting us in a fix. And there was a lot of controversy around that, but it was something, and what I told Dwight and what my view of it, and Dwight concurred, and what I told the board, people support financially groups that do the things they want to support. It's that darn simple. You can't say, give me money because I'm a good group. Why are you a good group? What are you doing? And I was like, you know what? People around this group want to save birds. Our message should be save birds. We're not here to save the world. We're not here to save the whale. We're not here to save a redwood tree. We're about birds. That's what we're about. Let's put it in narrow lane. We're going to be about bird conservation. We're not doing the whole state. We're going to do right over here. This is our little area. We started doing hardcore advocacy, started doing some hardcore land protection and hardcore education, and kept a very narrow focus on that about bird conservation. Conservation messaging was the central theme of it and the focus. And, people, I would say it this way: more people are more committed about something that's a clearly defined view and vision of where they want this group to go, and people support that, as opposed to a very general, wide thing of, well, we want to help the environment. Okay, well, there's 1,000 groups competing in that space. There aren't that many people saying, I want to protect birds and bird habitat. So, okay, maybe you can get 10,000 people to send you $10 to save the environment. Our situation back then was, okay, let's get 100 hardcore donors and hardcore leaders to say, we're going to protect this area around Houston, Galveston, Bolivar, High Island, and that's what we're going to stay focused on. So we did the organization grow? Yes. The financial support came faster and easier than I think any of us envisioned, and it was reassuring, but it was a reaction to a very clearly stated message of, this is who we are. This is what we are about. And it was really crystal clear. There was no ambiguity in it. We are going to save Bolivar Flats, period. You got that? We're on board. And people like that. And, you don't need 10,000 members to do that. If you get a handful, they're saying, this is it, and that's the message. Now, back then, the way the board was structured, the organization wasn't just the board, but there was a commitment if you came on as a president, is 2 years as president-elect, 2 years as president, 2 years as past president. And the idea, keep in mind, back then, again, it was a little volunteer group. So having succession in that position was critical to make sure there would still be somebody willing to step up. And then there are other Audubon groups that have had real problems with that succession of who's going to come in when this president gets tired or burns out or quits. And I can tell you back then, it was a full-time job for the president. I was doing my law practice all day and then doing this a lot of the time, but it was an incredibly full-time job, managing an organization and fundraising and advocacy and a lot of things going on. So anyway, I came on, like I said, I think Dwight, somebody will have to check the dates, but Dwight took over. He was president-elect when P.D. Hulse was president. P.D. was dealing with some things and, had to kind of step out of the picture way ahead of schedule. And so Dwight stepped up as president-elect and was kind of running things. And he called me and said, hey, man, I need some help. It's like, let's do it. And so I kind of came in ahead of schedule, off the books, helping Dwight. And then I think formally came on the board, had to be in 1999, officially as president-elect. And then back then, the boards would transition at the end of May. They ran on a school year. Meetings would be September to May. So at the end of the May is when the old board would go out, new board would come in. They had the summer off, no meetings, no nothing, and then kick up again in September. So that's why I officially came on the board. Had to be May of 99. Been helping Dwight and doing stuff before then, though. Formulating kind of this three-pronged approach to help solidify Houston Audubon, stabilize it, energize it, and then accomplish what we both saw as the threats that were imminent to the places we loved for birding in Bolivar and High Island area particularly, and then some coastal prairie stuff, West Town. But anyway, so we had the three-pronged approach, which some of it kind of been there and off and on a little bit, but it's education, advocacy, and land protection. And Houston Audubon had done those kind of things in fits and spurts, but we tried to really formalize and build the infrastructure to support those three prongs, and then create a professional staff that would be a framework that would be a constant, that would allow some consistency over time, so you don't have just a board of volunteers changing half the group every other year and lose a vision and lose energy and passion. So the idea was put that professional staff in place to bring expertise to it on the education front, on conservation front, on the fundraising front. This is a whole separate question, but we had really a handful of key women that were the primary drivers in the financial support of this organization. Now, I mean, we would not be here today without I can count on one hand, that took it on as a full-time job all day, every day, bringing the money to the table to keep things happening. And we said, okay, we got to get them some help, because they, every year they're like, okay, we're tired, we're out. It's like, okay, well, thanks, but you can't quit quite yet. One more week, do one more thing. And I just can't emphasize that enough. But anyway, so we did this period of the late 90s and early 2000s was a massive transition for this organization of trying to put that structural framework in place with the staff, stabilize it, make it a self-supporting, self-sustaining business. I want to say 97 was the first acquisition at Bolivar Flats. There were 4 sanctuaries at High Island already there. That was done, I want to say, 70s, 80s period. Bolivar in the 80s had just these bollards put up, and that was the only thing that was protected at Bolivar. So we looked at, and Dwight was living in Galveston at the time, so he was really tuned into what the local plans were for development in that area. And it was right by the ferry, and people wanted to build beach houses and business. And so Dwight's like, man, we got problems developing over here. And it's like, yeah, it looks like it. And so anyway, that's when the real push, I want to say it was 97, could be 98, is when the first piece of Bolivar was actually purchased outright by Houston Audubon, about 150, 60 acres. Right on the heels of that, Mr. Tyra, I can't remember his first name, Lewis? Tyra called up and said, look, I got an undivided interest in this property. Well, I'll donate it. I'll give y'all this. It was a majority interest in it, in the property. It was like 1,100 acres or so. My numbers could be off. But it was a substantial block of holding there. And so he said, I'll do that. And a developer had a piece of it, and it was kind of a complicated thing. It took years, and Joy Hester worked on that a lot with Winnie, trying to work through that situation. And that's when we took on really the first major fundraising effort to buy about 600 acres of Bolivar. That was a pivotal meeting where the board's like, yeah, we're going to do this, and the staff's essentially saying, we're out, we're done. It's like, we just got to do it. It's just got to be done. And so that started. Then same kind of development threat was there. Port Bolivar, which is the other side of the road by the ferry, wanted to have a big marina and beach house kind of development. And so they had to do wetland mitigation. And there was a beautiful piece of pristine marsh on the intercoastal side down close to Rollover Pass. And so we were talking with them about, hey, how about this over here? And they're like, okay, well, we'll buy that as long as you take it and hold it. We're not going to hold it. And it's like, okay. And then same kind of thing, the board's like, we're taking on more land? It's like, hey, it doesn't cost us anything this time. It's good. People are like, we're building up all these sanctuaries, and there's a lot of costs that go with running that and taking care of it. And it's like, yeah, but look at this prairie. And I remember Winnie was like, we don't need any more. I can't run anymore. And Winnie was a volunteer back then. And, we were like, talking to her, like, we got to help get her subsidized. And so we made her a paid staff member, subsidized volunteers, about what it amounted to. But Winnie's like, man, we're taking on too much. I got to manage all this. Like, okay, well, Winnie, but let's just go look at this, take a look at it. It looks pretty good. And she went and looked at it. She came back, okay, you're right. I can't stand it. We got to do this. And so she kind of got on board with it, and then the board got on board with it. And so that was donated. We didn't have to pay for that. And then more pieces of Bolivar, once the kind of word got out in the community that, hey, we're trying to do this, well, people got behind it and they're supporting it. And so kind of one thing led to another thing. And it's like, well, here's an opportunity for you, and there's an opportunity. And at the time I was officing live in Austin. Another side story. But anyway, I live in Austin, coming down here running Houston Audubon. But a few floors below me, where I office downtown Congress, was the Texas Nature Conservancy office. So I got to know all the people in that office and talking with them about what their game plan was. And they had a model of, land has to be certain size and certain characteristics. And then say, we need to get with TPWD and Fish and Wildlife, and let's all coordinate who's doing what, so we're all not competing for funds for the same kinds of properties. And so we worked out an informal gentleman's agreement where huge scale projects, Fish and Wildlife ultimately would try and take those. Either they'd get the funding to buy them outright, big blocks like you see in the Brazoria complex. Next step down, the low thousands of acres, the Nature Conservancy would try and tackle those. We committed to stuff that was in the hundreds of acres in the Galveston-ish Bolivar area. We'd tackle those. And then things below that, we'd try and find somebody else to get them to take it. So we kind of had this informal working agreement, but everybody was in agreement. There was a lot of development pressure in that area. So we all kind of, just through the serendipity of me officing, a few floors above them, worked out this agreement and kind of made that a focal point, and it worked great. And because we're all trying to protect stuff in the general area, but we're not competing for the same funds for the same projects, and it worked real well. I think you're asking about GCBO and the Katy Prairie Conservancy. GCBO, original Gulf Coast Bird Observatory, originally was an idea. I don't know who first thought it up, but the idea was going to be that it was modeled after the Point Reyes Bird Observatory in California, where you have a permanent scientific station manned around the clock with true bona fide professional scientists, and they would study bird migration, in that area. I mean, clearly, High Island's a critical, in the upper Texas coast, critical to bird migration and bird conservation area. And so the idea is, well, we'll do like Point Reyes Bird Observatory, and we'll make the Houston Audubon Bird Observatory. It was going to be in Smith Oaks in the pump house, and it was going to be all renovated and turned into a place for them to live and have scientific research. Except problem was no one wanted to live in High Island with mosquitoes all through the summer and year round. And so that idea didn't really kind of get off the ground. It's like, okay, well, that didn't work. Now what? And so ideas like, well, let's start some programs and do some research. And it was volunteer research at the time because we didn't have scientists. And so I was like, you know what? We got enough things going on. And this is predating me a little bit, but it's like, there's enough irons in the fire out here. Let's just take the idea, the word Gulf Coast Bird Observatory, and make it its own thing. It can be its own standalone group, work on its own fundraising, and then it can pursue and evolve with its own board about its own mission about scientific research. And so that was a spin-off of an idea of Houston Audubon trying to do it at High Island, but it didn't happen. But Dow Chemical, who had been a very gracious supporter of Houston Audubon, and then the Damuth Foundation, Malcolm C. Damuth, was a major supporter of Houston Audubon when he was alive, and his son Craig. And so they became one of the key founders, donors to give GCBO financial footing to start off. There's a piece at the end, don't let me forget, somebody remind me to talk about Malcolm Damuth, because I want to tell his story before we get off the tape. But Katy Prairie Conservancy, same kind of thing. We were talking about the threats to the habitat on Bolivar. Coastal prairies are the single most imperiled of all types of habitats, period. There's less than 1% approximately of original native prairies left. That's it. Whereas you look at, say, pristine wetlands, about 20% remain. Original forest, 50%. And like I said earlier, people say, you see a tree cut down, people react. Wetlands, people are kind of tuned into, hey, that's important, but that's 20%. Coastal prairies, 1%, but there are a lot of birds that depend on that. Water quality depends on it. And Fred Collins, who was the president of Houston Audubon, lived out on the Katy Prairie. And so he was like, man, we got to do this. They were messaging and doing a lot of advocacy back in the particularly the 90s, trying, this is an important area. We got to do something about this. Bob Maggie Honig were two others. They were really drivers. Fred Collins, Bob Maggie Honig, they were there. Bob Bierstock's another. But, they were wired into, this is a good thing out here. It's where I saw my first bald eagles out there. But Fred's just like, man, we got to do something. And so same kind of thing, it's like, okay, well, Houston Audubon's, got a lot of things cooking. We're going to focus on Bolivar. And it's like, look, let that just be its own thing where it focuses every bit of energy it's got on protecting that prairie. And so that's where the Katy Prairie Conservancy came from. Again, a core of people that were that energized core of Houston Audubon people, but that was the ecosystem they were saying, I'm passionate about this. I want to save it. And so those folks planted that seed and that took off. Malcolm C. Dameth was one of the absolute key, steady donors, year in, year out, just a bedrock go-to person that was always there to help Houston Audubon. Malcolm had early on made his life's way and done very well for himself through exploitation of the East Texas forest and wetlands through timber, logging, oil, but things, at the time and way they were done were very exploitative. And he grew up and saw that vanishing in front of his eyes and kind of had a real change of how he viewed things. Not that he was anti-logging or anti-oil, but he's like, we just got to do these things differently. And then he became very passionate about conservation of those East Texas habitats. And so he donated some of the crown jewels of his holdings, which are now the Dameth Sanctuary, in the East Texas habitats with the bog plants and the forest and red-cockaded woodpeckers. But it was just a change, not of heart, but a change of how to handle that habitat. And then he put money into conservation and conservation advocacy for that. And then his son, he ingrained that in his son. And when Malcolm passed, his son Craig Dameth set up a foundation in his father's name, the Malcolm C. Dameth Foundation. I was one of the founding board members of that. And it was to be broader than just bird grants and conservation, but it was, clearly in the time I was on that board and set up, bird conservation was a major driving component of it. But it was really focused on, again, ecosystem habitat preservation and conservation. So the message and lesson I would tell people to keep in mind out of that, don't demonize people. I can't emphasize this enough. Every person we come into contact with in our daily life, whether we're wearing a Houston Audubon hat or just our normal daily life, every person out there is critical to the success of conservation. We're not going to make a sustainable ecosystem by buying it up acre at a time. We're only going to really save ecosystems when we have it as a community value. And that's important to keep in mind. We have to have oil and gas. We have to have pipelines. We have to have lumber. It's a sustainable resource. Don't demonize those people. They care. Some of them do. Some of them don't. I fight some of the bad ones every day for a living now. But the key is to get them to look at things differently so that we can help them do their business and serve their goals, but also think about how can we change that model so that they can do logging, they can do oil and gas extraction in a way that is protective of the environment. Today, this isn't a criticism, it's just an observation, but today we hear climate change relentlessly on the TV. Well, that's important for sure. I'm beyond concerned, though, that is sucking all the air out of the room to a whole lot of really important conservation issues that are now getting lost in the dialogue. Everybody thinks, well, if we fix climate change, everything's fixed. That's not so. Let me tell you, in the state of Texas, water is the issue. If you say, here's the 10 most hot button priorities for conservation, the first 5 are going to be about water. And that's fallen off the table. So, don't put the blinders on. Oh, climate change, we say fix that, everything's fixed. It's not. Endangered species are still critical. When I was doing a lot of work for Houston Audubon and taking people out, I took some very wealthy people from Europe birding around Texas. They called, there may be another piece of history you want to capture about Donald O'Brien and Jerry Bertrand in a minute, but anyway, Donald and Jerry were friends with a man named Tasso Leventis, one of the richest people in the world. His family owned Coca-Cola in 37 countries and Greek shipping lines. I mean, wildly wealthy, but very low profile. Tasso, kind of like Malcolm, grew up in a family that made their wealth through exploitation of resources, but kind of like Malcolm had that vision of, wait, this stuff I'm around me is vanishing. He grew up in West Africa and saw it vanishing in front of his eyes. And same kind of epiphany. Tasso Leventis is like, I got to do things differently here. I got to change the way my family's doing things. And he changed that. And that he was a hardcore birder, and that was his passion, bird photography. Jerry Bertrand connected, was the one asked me to take Tasso birding around Texas. And Jerry Bertrand, who's on the Houston Audubon Board of Advisors, literally helped write the Endangered Species Act. I mean, that generation, this stuff hadn't been around forever. It's in our lifetime. This stuff's happening. But those kind of things are still critical that we got to preserve. These other environmental issues, keep them as part of the dialogue. It was really when I started doing volunteer work for Houston Audubon. I was doing endangered species issues for Houston Audubon related to some of their sanctuaries. And then also they would ask, hey, we need to make public comments on this or that. I remember, for example, one of the East Texas sanctuaries had an oil company came in and bulldozed some trees. And, so we got involved. And so I was doing that pro bono since the 90s. But in 2011, Jim Blackburn had a case going in federal court against the state of Texas and several river authorities related to the deaths of whooping cranes at the Aransas Refuge. And he asked me to come help him with that trial. We were in trial for 2 weeks. I had very heavy trial experience, and that's kind of been my niche through the years, is actually, really trying cases. A lot of people talk about being lawyers, but, it's kind of like there's lots of doctors. There aren't a whole lot of real surgeons. Same kind of thing about really people going to trial. So that's what I've always done, is really try cases. So Jim said, hey, this thing's going to trial. I'm going to need some help. And he was up against some pretty nasty players on the other side of the law firm that had defended the tobacco companies. And I kept telling him, Jim, these guys are dirty. They're going to play rough with you. And he's like, we got this. First deposition just blew up. He's like, call me the next day. He's like, okay, you were right. These guys are dirty. Really? I was like, yeah. He's like, well, come help me try this. So we were in trial for 2 weeks. He had a wonderful team of lawyers. And so I was really, very lucky to help with that group of super talented lawyers, five lawyers in the courtroom. Jim was the lead on it. And that really became kind of just like, okay, this is my passion. That was in 2011. I've been involved with Houston Audubon. I've been involved with conservation, but it was a way to meld the passion of conservation, take the tools and experience I had from the legal universe, kind of bring them together. And then about 5-6 years ago, there was a real flurry of pipeline activity through South Texas. Some of my ranching friends all of a sudden were really the next pivotal moment was a man 30 days from trial. He had an oil and gas lawyer. He's like, man, we're going to trial in 30 days. We're getting killed. Would you help me? I'm like, 30 days out from trial, I don't know if I can really do much for you, but sure, I'll help you. And sure enough, we make a long story short, we mobilized some biologists and went out, found ocelots on his land. And I'd known they were there from prior work with him, but we found them. Fish and Wildlife Service like, holy cow, this guy's got ocelots. And yeah, stopped the pipeline. And man, that one call from that rancher, after Jim's work, it just snowballed after that. So it kind of came to me, and I'm like, I love this. And, I've been fortunate to have some tremendous, wonderful ranchers. And again, that's where I go back. Don't demonize these people. bulk of this land in this state's owned by private landowners. They are the keys to success. We can save thousands of acres on Bolivar. What we need is the millions landscape scale stuff, the ethics of those ranchers to think, I've got to take care of this. I'm telling you, most of the ranches I deal with, tremendous stewards of their wildlife and their lands. Incredible. And I've been very fortunate to work for the King Ranch, the O'Connors, many others, and some small ranches. And they are passionate. So, don't wall those people off. They are keys to success. I'd just like to add as a bit, one extra bit of history here, because it's not well known, is there were two gentlemen on the board of advisors of Houston Audubon for many years, Donald O'Brien and Jerry Bertrand. And people say, who are these people? Where do they come from? Donald lived in the Houston area out in Sugar Land, and Jerry lives in Massachusetts. And you think, how are these two guys connected to Houston Audubon? And the short answer, and there's a way long version of this that we'll tell it another day, but Donald O'Brien was the chairman of National Audubon in 2001, 2002, at the time I was president. Jerry was the vice chair. They were hardcore birders. I mean, as hardcore as anybody that walks the planet. They are all about birds. They love watching them. They travel, they chase them, and they're hardcore about bird conservation. The two of them they were the key sparks that started the American Bird Conservancy, because they were angry that National Audubon wasn't hardcore bird enough. And so they said, we're going to start ABC to be about birds, when they couldn't get National Audubon to do enough about birds. So, I mean, they're serious about bird stuff. Bird conservation is why they wake up every day. Donald was, I don't know his title, but he was a very senior officer of Phillips Petroleum at the time. Phillips had been historically a good supporter of Houston Audubon. Jerry had been a staff lawyer for Richard Nixon on his White House staff as a lawyer. He was trained professionally as a biologist and then went back to law school and became a lawyer, but literally helped write portions of the Endangered Species Act. And people are today, you think, this law's been around forever. No, it hasn't. It's been here since 1973. Of all people, Richard Nixon was the president, when the Endangered Species Act got signed and put into law. But Jerry helped write part of it. So how they get connected to Houston Audubon? In 2002, National Audubon had a meeting in Houston, March, and I looked it up and got the little card from the thing. But they had a national board meeting in Houston, and they were announcing to all of us, invite us to go, that they were going to, open up a whole bunch of centers here and kind of take things over and take our donors, and we could help them, of course, but they would gladly take our sanctuaries and our donors. Like, yeah, no. Well, they had a bus tour birding trip the day before their formal board meeting, and they said they had us set up a tour to take them bird watching, big like Greyhound bus kind of thing, and they filled it up. And Donald and Jerry wanted to go see some birds, and they brought some staff and some board members, people that were into birds, and got a little spiel about when we're making a tour loop from Houston, go out I-10 east where I first birded over the Trinity River and High Island, come back through Bolivar and finish in Galveston, come back to Houston. So we did that little loop that day, telling them all the things Houston Audubon was involved in. That was in the middle of the Bolivar campaign. And they were like, man, this is what we want National Audubon to do. You guys are kicking it. You're just right on, man. This is exactly what we want y'all to do. And John Flicker at the time was like, we're going to take y'all over and do all this and stuff. And so Donald and Jerry, Donald's the chairman of the board, Jerry's the vice chair. They're like, hands off. You leave these guys alone. We're putting a protective wall around them. I hate to use wall these days, but we're putting them, they're off limits. You leave them alone. They're doing exactly what we want done. So Flicker, you stay away from them. You leave their donors alone. Don't cause problems. And so I was like, well, Jerry, would you mind being on our board of advisors? So he's like, I'd be proud to be on your board. Donald, how about you? I'm on. Let's do it. I'm all about birds. You do it. And so that's how they came to be on our board of advisors and remained there for many, many years. And Donald passed away several years ago. Jerry's still alive. But Jerry, I talk to every week, and he still asks about Houston Audubon, and he's very committed. So that's the short story of those two gentlemen, how they came to be connected to Houston Audubon. Don't become stagnant. Don't become just a place where you show up for work every day to make a paycheck and just status quo isn't good enough. That ain't going to cut it. Be passionate about your work. Be an advocate. We are here to try and make a difference. And the real way we make a difference from the conservation community is through creating a culture and a mindset of conservation. And that's true for every group across the board, from the littlest to the very biggest dump. So don't stagnate and rest on your backside. Get out there and be an advocate every day.